Today's lesson is called Percents and Decimals. Now that you know how to use fractions to solve percent problems, you're going to learn how to use decimals. And before we get started, we'll go over our vocabulary. The first vocabulary word is a repeat. We learned this in the last lesson, percent. The percent is a ratio. It's a fraction where the denominator is always 100. Literally, from Latin, percent means per 100, parts of 100. Our second vocabulary word is a word that's not new to you, but it's not something we've had so formally this year. Decimals. Decimals are numbers in which the ones place and the tenths place are separated by decimal points. Let's start looking at our first of four examples. I'll read it to you in case you can't see it. To write a decimal as a percent, there are two steps that you have to do. One, first you have to multiply the decimal by 100. And you can do that in one of two ways. You can either write out the multiplication problem of the decimal times 100, or you can simply move the decimal point 2 places to your right, because you will end up with the same answer. Do whichever one is easier for you. After you multiply the decimal by 100, add the percent sign. So let's take a look at this first one. We have 0.47. When we move the decimal place 2 points, 2 places to the right, we end up moving the decimal place from before the 4 to after the 7, which gives us the whole number 47 with the percent sign. We know that in the decimal 0.47, which is 47 hundredths, means the same as 47%, 47 parts of 100. Let's take a look at a decimal here. We have 0.6. So I'm going to rewrite it here, 0.6, and multiplying it by 100 again means moving the decimal point 1, 2 places here. But what happens is when you have a place with no number in it, you fill it with a 0. So 0.6, which is 6 tenths, after you multiply it by 100 is 60 hundredths, which is 60%. And let's take a look over here. Here we have a mixed number. We have 2.853. That means more than twice as much. That's more than 200%. We take our decimal, we move it to the right 2 places, 1, 2. So now it is after the 5. So 2.853 means the same as 285.3%. So you see, we don't always end up with a whole number. Sometimes we will have a decimal as a percent. Now let's look at our second example. Now, to write a percent as a decimal, we're going the other way. 2 steps. First, divide the percent by 100. And when you divide a number by 100, what you're doing is taking that decimal point and moving it 2 places to the left. And then all you have to do after that is remove the percent sign. So let's take a look here. We have 72%. And I went ahead and I rewrote the number without the percent sign already. Now when you see the number 72, you know, even though it's not there, that the decimal is here after the 72. So again, to divide by 100 means moving the decimal point twice to the left, and we end up with 0.72. Let's take a look at what happens when we change 3% to a decimal. Again, we write the number 3, and I took off the percent sign. And we know that the decimal is assumed here after the 3. We move it backwards 2 places, and the rule is the same as it was in the first example. When you end up with an empty space, you fill it with a 0. So 3% in decimal form is 0.03, which makes sense because 3%, 3 parts of 100, 0.03 is 3 hundredths. And then 125%. The steps don't change even though the numbers are different. We move our decimal place from after the 5 to the left 2 places, and we end up with 1.25. Not too hard. Now, our third example. Our third example actually reviews a little bit from the previous lesson to write a fraction as a percent. The first thing you do, you already know, is to convert the fraction to a decimal. And how do we do that? Remember, fractions are actually division problems. So we divide the numerator by the denominator to get our decimal. And since we're moving from a decimal to a percent, we are going to multiply the decimal by 100, which means moving the decimal point 2 places to the right, and then after we do that, we affix a percent sign. So here we're starting out with 5 over 8, 5/8. And when you do your long division and you divide 5 by 8, we end up with a terminating decimal, 0.625. When we move it, the decimal place 2 places to the right to multiply by 100, we end up with 62.5%. Down here, if you can see it, we have 3 over 2. Now, when you look at 3/2, you know that that's an improper fraction. So that means that we are going to end up with a number that is greater than 100%. When you do your multiplying, your dividing, 3 divided by 2, you end up with a repeating decimal, 1.3 infinity. So what I did was I wrote several 3's so that when we move our decimal place to the right 2 spots, we don't accidentally insert zeros for empty spots. We want to remember that since it's repeating, every place after 1 3 repeats to 3's in infinity. So we end up with 133.3. Don't forget the bar across to show that it continues to repeat. So 3/2 is 133.3%. And now for our last example. To find the percent of a number, what we learned in the last lesson was setting up a proportion where we had a percent over 100% and our part over our whole. Well, here's a different way to solve the same type of problem. And here are our steps. The first thing we do, if you choose not to use the proportion method, is to convert the percent to decimal. And I have a few examples here. Just so you remember from before, to move from a percent to a decimal means dividing the number by 100. So 12% becomes 0.12. Here we're looking for 12% of 250. So our 12% is 0.12. You remember from the last lesson that almost always in math, the word of means to multiply, and then we just bring down our number. Because remember, if we look at the steps, we first convert the percent to a decimal, then we multiply the decimal and the number. And when we multiply 0.12 times 250, we end up with 30. So 12% of 250 is 30. Let's take a look at our next one. Here we want to know what 115% of 21 is. Now before we get to this part, I want to point something out. When you are starting, when your percent is more than 100%, then your final answer is going to be greater than the number you're starting with because you're talking about more than that. So our 115% in a decimal, because we would take the decimal and move it 2 places to the left, becomes 1.15. And again, the word of means to multiply. So 1.15 times 21 is 24.15. In our last example, we have 0.328% of 11. That's a very, very small number. What we mean here is about 1/3 of 1% of 11, which means our answer is going to be much, much smaller than our original number. Now remember, the steps don't change just because the numbers are very different. When we divide 0.328 by 100, we get 0.00328 times 11, and our answer is 0.03608. It might sound like a lot, but I think the steps are very easy to follow. You should have no problem.